If you say race all the time and you're racing to some defined end state, like a super weapon, right, or explosive national growth, and if you can preserve that goal, right, and keep adversaries from doing it, if that's what your view of this is, you have a couple of things working. It tells you to avoid any discussion of safety, right? It becomes like existential to get there first. All the questions about how this should work for human flourishing, how you put some kind of reasonable guardrails around it. If that's our view of how AI is going to develop and we're in a race, it is actually, from the military standpoint, destabilizing. Imagine you're China and you think the US is like on the verge of creating a super weapon that will allow it to perpetually dominate the world. You don't just sit by and say like, okay, that's fine. Right, you're engaged in cyber espionage, cyber attacks, right? You may actually go kinetic. This is why race dynamics are very dangerous, and why, if you go through history, when we talk about the nuclear arms race, not many good things came from that, right? It was, in retrospect, right, a lot of wasted money, a lot of wasted effort, a lot of brinksmanship. The world was at risk. So I think, the history of like race analogies are not really that persuasive.
This is Daniel Fagelli. You're tuned in to The Trajectory. This is the 5th episode in our series on U.S.-China AGI Relations. We have Brad Carson on for this episode. Brad functionally ran the Army under the Obama administration. He's been an international relations professor, the president of a university, and also a congressman. Brad also is currently the president of Americans for Responsible Innovation. Normally, when I see folks in the public sector, my presumption is their AI and especially AGI takes are pretty subpar. Brad's in this series because he's very much the opposite of that. I saw one of Brad's talks at FAR AI. FAR AI had an event where he spoke with a lot of erudition and sort of the right degree of skepticism around all kinds of elements of AI and AGI. I think you'll enjoy this episode. His analogies to the Cold War and mistakes we want to avoid, I think, are the most salient part of this episode. And I'm somewhat surprised that the same points haven't been brought up before. I think they also give hope to potentially decent relations despite the competition with China. I'm going to save all my commentary for the end of the episode as usual. So if you want those, you can stick around. But otherwise, without further ado, this is Brad Carson here on The Trajectory. So Brad, welcome to the show.
Dan, great to be with you.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be able to dive in. You've got some varied experience here, Brad, very different from other folks that are in the DoD. I mean, you functionally ran the Army under Obama. You've done your work in Congress, and now, of course, running Americans for Responsible Innovation with a heck of a lot of focus on AI and AGI. Not a lot of DoD folks think seriously about the G part of that AGI. And some people would say that there's a bit of a potential escalation between the U.S. and China around pushing for increasingly powerful AI systems. Some people refer to it as a race. I wonder, when you speak to leaders, what do you think is important for them to know about all this economic and military sort of force going into compute and into power and into more and more powerful and autonomous systems on both the U.S. and Chinese side? What are the nutshell insights that leaders, policymakers should understand about what's happening here, to your conception?
I think two things. One is they should know what that G means, artificial general intelligence, or sometimes you hear artificial super intelligence, ASI, or transformative AI, TAI, mostly talking about the same thing. And I think leaders should appreciate it more. Many of them are very practically minded, especially in the military. And so when you talk about these kind of ideas that seem, out of their experience, right, it seems fantastical. Yeah. And so it seems like something that very practical men and women shouldn't think about. But it is very important they understand those ideas. And I think the second thing is we have this broader national consensus now among both parties that we're in a race with China, not just on AI, but really on every front, for geopolitical dominance, for economic supremacy, these kind of questions. And I think the race obscures as much as it illuminates, right? We are in a race in some ways. I prefer to think of it as a competition. Competition is not necessarily militaristic, right? It doesn't necessarily have a final conclusion. It helps you kind of keep expectations in line as well as to make sure you don't overreact. Because if you believe you're in a race to some goal that you have to achieve and the first person there wins forever and ever, then right, it's going to lead you to a lot of thinking through about policy that might actually be unwise.
Well, let's get under the hood there, because I'm going to sort of look at all sides of the coin on exactly that. But talk a little bit of it. So I think this is a great distinction. A race has an end. There is a winner, and that, whoever won the 1962 Olympics for the high jump or something, it's like that's who won it. That we don't go backwards on that. But a competition, between businesses or between, siblings or whatever, it doesn't necessarily have to involve, like competition doesn't involve like malice. It could just be steel sharpening steel. And then also it could be kind of ongoing. It could just be something that's happening, Coke and Pepsi, whatever the case may be. It's not the same sort of like, we're both going to sprint and once we get there, haha, it's all over. Where do you see the policy detriment of the race view? What do you fear could happen from a policy standpoint, particularly around AGI here? We're talking about the big picture. If we say race all the time.
If you say race all the time and you're racing to some defined end state, like a super weapon, right, or explosive national growth that allows your country to kind of dominate the world and have just more national power, and if you can preserve that goal, right, and keep adversaries from doing it, I think if that's what your view of this is, I think you have a couple of things working. One is it tells you to avoid any discussion of safety. Right? It becomes like existential to get there first. And so, right, all the questions about how this should work for human flourishing, how you put some kind of reasonable guardrails around it, right? The case for just like going balls to the wall, if you will. It's just compelling to you, right? So I think that's one danger. I think the second idea is if that's our view of how AI is going to develop and we're in a race, it is actually from the military standpoint destabilizing. And, people have written a bit about this. And the idea is like, imagine you're China and you think the U.S. is like on the verge of creating a super weapon that will allow it to perpetually dominate the world. You don't just sit by and say like, okay, that's fine. Right, you're engaged in cyber espionage, cyber attacks, right? You may actually go kinetic. If you think like, hey, this data center is creating something that will work against our national interest in perpetuity. So this is why race dynamics are very dangerous and why if you go through history, when we talk about the nuclear arms race, not many good things came from that, right? It was, in retrospect, right, a lot of wasted money, a lot of wasted effort, a lot of brinksmanship where, right, we got up to the edge, threatened lots of things, and the world was at risk. So I think, the history of like race analogies are not really that persuasive.
Yeah. So it's limiting, it's fettering, can maybe lead us to short-sightedness or more aggression than would be warranted with kind of a longer term view or this more kind of competitive framing that you're saying. So that's an important lens. And we're going to circle back into that about this idea of kind of super weapon and, some of the phraseology you just brought up. But about this current dynamic, a lot of it does seem, at least from Trump, to seem like it is economic. You had kind of framed, I think elsewhere in another talk, sort of a lot of the competition feels like it's kind of economic competition around AGI, where this stuff are going. And when Trump wants to win on AI, it doesn't seem self-evident that he's talking about the creation of this eternal post-human intelligence that is like a robot bald eagle that can circle the earth a million times a second and sort of rule the world. It seems sort of like it's another industry, right? It's like oil or it's like steel or it's like, with whatever else. It seems like maybe that's the way he talks about it. Xi, I think, does have a pretty good understanding of the bigger picture implications of AGI. I think he can play a mental movie that's a little bit different than like, yeah, it'll be like more money from like an economic thing. I think he sees a bigger picture there. How do you see it? I mean, there's an economic side, there's a military side, there is a national prominence and interest side. What should leaders understand just about the dynamic? What are the important components of our relative competition and climbing mutually that leaders should grok? They should understand.
Well, I think you're onto something here. There is a point of comparison between President Trump and Xi, which is I think both of them are interested in like national champions, and that's not historically the American president's view of things, right? We didn't care this company was a particular national champion. We admired our companies, but you think of China really trying to have like champions, right, for the nation. I think that many people in Washington today see OpenAI or Anthropic, Google, right? These are national champions in kind of a mercantilist economic worldview, right? Washington a lot. So I think that's part of it. I think it's a very like significant part. I think what leaders should appreciate, I think they appreciate this in terms of the words, but not the implications, is AI is a dual-use technology. Right? It's going to transform the economy in every way. It's going to transform how we do military. And so it's going to change perhaps the very nature of what it means to have a society, a democracy, what it means to even be human. And I think people don't really appreciate that this is something that's going to be more transformative perhaps than they've seen, maybe in the history of man, maybe, in hundreds of years. You could argue this case, but it's going to have massive social implications, some combination of electricity, the internal combustion engine, the book, the rise of literacy, but all of these had like incredible changes to like what it meant to be a human. And AI is likely to do the same.
Yeah, well, this idea of national champions is sort of interesting. And I think the degree of change, I'm definitely going to double click with you in a second. But when you said national champions and you said this kind of mercantilist analogy, my brain went to like, the Dutch East India Company or British East, like it's something. I'm not saying at all that there's direct analogies there, but I think the idea of having a company, that was a real boom in wealth for those nations, right? I mean, that was the Anglo world, if we include the Dutch in there, I think culturally not exactly the polar opposites of the Brits. That was a pop off. That was, it was Venice that was kind of the big dog on this side of the world for a minute. But that was major. That was a tipping point of sort of like how wealth and power sort of happened for like a couple hundred years straight up. And of course, China paid a bit of the price on that. There were some knocks on the door and some insistence on trade, and there was some opium stuff that happened. Ming Yuan got burned down. Lots of rough times during that period. I wonder. I mean, I haven't talked to people. I just came back from Shanghai. I didn't talk to anybody about this, but does it feel like there's momentum for like, hey, maybe this will be a champion that's not just the champion at making car tires or the champion at making ball bearings, but the champion of like defining power? I mean, it feels to me like there's a pinch of this, but let me know if you're sensing any of the same.
No, I think you're right about that. I mean, many of the advocates for AI say, look, this is going to boost economic growth. We're tired of that 1, 2, 3% growth. Some people say we'll get 10, 20, even exponential growth, right? So as an instrument of national power, of prosperity, right, being the leader in AI is not the wrong approach to it, right? If you believe that AI can do these things, you certainly want to inure yourself quickly, right, to the benefits of it. So they're not wrong to think in these terms if that's kind of your approach. It is going to probably be a great engine for wealth, as well as having, like I said, national security implications, soft power implications. And it's certainly right, if you're any American leader of either party, to want the U.S. to be in the lead in this.
Yeah. And there, even the folks who are the farthest thing from a war hawk, I think, would still say, okay, well, all things considered, let's still make sure we're really competitive and strong, and maybe a pinch or two ahead of the game here. So I'm with you there. We'll talk a little bit about the super weapon notion that you brought up, and Shanahan was on the show and sort of mentioned that he doesn't really see any one technology kind of eternally dominating, the way war works. And I think you had a talk where you sort of questioned whether that's something we should suspect either. And I think it's a very reasonable supposition. I mean, the internet didn't like immediately change everything about the battlefield. Even the tank didn't like immediately change everything. Of course, there were some large shifts, but it wasn't sort of like one tech and then like, oop, it's all over. This is what it's all about. It's gradual. Adoption is remarkably slow, as you would know darn well. Into the DoD for a lot of this stuff in practical terms. I do wonder, though, sort of presuming that, and I'll just give you a hypothetical. I'm not sold on this, but I'll give you a hypothetical. You had brought up sort of ahead of our recording that within our lifetimes, it seems like AGI is somewhat likely. Maybe it's in 2 years in the super aggressive side. Maybe it's, decades or what have you. But within our lifetimes, we have to prepare for it. I'm going to just throw a hypothetical at you, see how you react. So there's some folks that would say, okay, AGI, what does it mean? Well, it means when I talk to my smartphone, it will be able to not just like recommend a Chinese restaurant, like it'll be able to create a real-time video about like how I could make Chinese food, and it could sort of like look through my smart glasses and tell me how to cut the scallions and whatever. And then it could also maybe do the grocery shopping for me. And if a product wasn't there, it could ask me if it wants to replace with something else. And and maybe at some point I'll even have a robot. Maybe I rent it from some central place, or maybe I have one that hangs out in its own little robo pantry where it recharges itself. I don't really know how this is going to work out, but I'll talk to my phone, and then by the time I get home, the robot has already done these things in the garden that I kind of remembered I should have done a while ago, or whatever the case may be. And that's AGI. There we have it. Things are quite different. AI is sort of being wielded in all these nimble ways, economically and otherwise, and of course militarily there's implications too. But I don't know, it is another tool at the end of the day. That's it. That's what AGI ends up being. There's another sort of side of the coin that would be all right, well, we have data centers in Qatar the size of sort of Rhode Island that are sort of with chips, 1,000x more powerful than Blackwell, that sort of really can do sort of the country of geniuses Dario analogy, and also have physical embodiment, not just robot one that cleans your house, but all the industrial robots. It's flying the jet planes, the fighter jets. It's got nanobots. So it's examining femto level analysis of nature. And it is drinking up and conceiving of access to nature itself in ways that humans can't conceive of. It's connecting dots between, psychology, history, whatever else, in ways that we can't. We have these little categories. It will have categories that are potentially as unexplainable to you and I as our conversation right now would be to your Labrador retriever. And so there's this massive overarching thing which could do things in reality that would be magic. When we launch a rocket to the moon, your Labrador doesn't know what's happening. But if it did, if it was as smart as, I don't know, maybe a chimp can understand, okay, that's a large thing, it's going upward. But it can't possibly know what's happening. If AGI is constantly doing those hyper miraculous things in many, many places, it would sort of be the last invention. Presumably, we would eventually be buffered out by waves of creative destruction that strong. And I think there are some people that say, well, whoever conjures that will ride the dragon. And whether the dragon ride is 2 days, 2 months, 2 years, or 2 decades, that's the last thing, because at some point those waves crash up hard enough on shore where we attenuate, just like every other species that's ever been, because things are going to be moving really quick. So I'm not saying I'm sold on that idea, but I'm saying there are reasonable, credible arguments in that direction as that being a possibility from your Benjios and your Hintons and these other people. What say you of that? Because if that be a reality, it might add a very different tinge to what competition implies here.
No, I think there are many people who see that as the future, right? Some of them think it will happen this decade. Some people may think it takes 30 or 40 years, especially as you talk about embodied AI in the terms of robots, right? Which is the last frontier to try to get, truly embodied AI out there to replace humans. But for my point is we will in our lifetime, and certainly in my son's lifetime, see those kind of robotic devices used and widely deployed. I'm very sympathetic when people like Tyler Cowen or the Epoch AI guys say, hey, there's a lot of frictions in the economy, right? There's a lot of reasons the AI is not going to be deployed as rapidly as you think, from labor unions to just business bureaucratic inertia to government regulation to mapping workflows is actually a much harder process than one imagines it to be. So I can say okay, that's a 10-year, 20-year horizon. But I have a hard time thinking, and I find very few people who think in 50 years, you don't have embodied AI in the form of robots widely deployed in basically every sector of human society. And I think, that scenario you gave, which is kind of the Wall-E version, right, where we've all been replaced and those who are still alive are, surviving on UBI perhaps and, reading books and painting, which is the ideal Sam Altman scenario, I suppose, right? We'll all be, indulging our creative side.
Yeah, sure.
Honestly, I hope we talk to the Chinese before we get there, right? Because that kind of world is one that is a bit scary to me in lots of reasons. I mean, I'll step back and I think, one of the points I often make to leaders, I think this is very important, is technology is not, we don't have to view it as deterministic. I mean, a lot of people say it's going to be built. Humans can do this, right? So it's going to be created. And whatever you can imagine on the far flung, a super weapon, whatever it might be, right? It's going to be done someday. And I say only if we humans choose to permit it to be done, which we might well do, just because we're looking the other way or powerful interests persuade us, right, that we can't get ourselves organized to defeat them. But there are lots of examples of technologies that we know how to do. For example, human cloning.
Cloning, yeah.
Human germline editing, right? We were able to do these things in the 70s, and we chose as a scientific community globally not to do them. So I think the first thing to tell leaders is like, this is a technology. It's not riding the tiger. We made the tiger. And if we want to tame it, put it back in the zoo, make it a house cat, not a lion, we can do all those kind of things, right? These are choices that politicians make. And therefore, we should be wise about it and get the right decisions there. And part of that is talking with the other, countries who are really working in this case. China, obviously, maybe Russia in the future, if Europe gets its act together, and saying like, hey, let's think about how this could be used for human flourishing again, to benefit us, right? Not to displace it all and not to create highly escalatory, very destabilizing kind of weapon systems, right? That could actually, end up in something kinetic that actually destroys the earth.
Yeah, well, I think, that there's a lot of frames here, and many of which are not in the agenda for this particular conversation. But I think there's a lot of grand questions to unpack about what ultimately is the purpose of this stuff. It does seem to me, Brad, if I zoom out, that there is a kind of grand process of life of which we are part. And it doesn't seem self-evident to me that in a million years or a trillion years, opposable thumbs are sort of the core locus of both moral value and volition in the entire cosmos until the heat death. It does strike me actually that that's exceedingly unlikely. But to your point, we have some ability to, of course, bend and control these things. I think what strikes me as different between cloning and AGI is that to clone a person seems like really sort of challenging in terms of like how valuable that is. Like if I wanted to take over the world, or like take over an industry, or just like have an ungodly amount of, some benefit that I think I can accrue, cloning Einstein or I don't know, Bonaparte. Who do we want to clone? I have no idea. Bonaparte would raised differently would have been a mathematician. You know what I mean? You see, he tried his hand at fiction for a while. We have no clue what happens. You raise one of these people elsewhere. It's just not. And if you could, what do you need? 25 years? Get out of town, right? Get out of town. But it strikes me that with AGI, there's a lot of forces driving people to want to push forward on this, to say, okay, we won't do it. And then to kind of make sure that they're pushing. It feels like in that, I'm not saying it's not like cloning in every way. Like we could have an Asilomar conference. There was one about AGI, however many years ago, right? 8 years ago, Jan Polsky was on it and whatnot. A bunch of the other folks. But it does feel like there's a little bit more heat behind driving this forward than cloning in terms of like how important it is. I'd love your thoughts on that.
I don't think it's heat. I think it's money, right? Sure, right? We didn't have a massive industry that's probably going to be, the capital investment alone, right, is $500 billion a year on an annual run rate right now, right? You don't have the money behind cloning or human germline editing that you have behind AGI. Now, I think you're right in much of what you said, but I think coming back to like, you think if I'm Xi Jinping, because we always say in America, the Chinese have the long view, right? This is something that we project onto them. You know what? Human germline editing, where I like raised the IQ of my population by 10 points, the mean IQ, or created some kind of like race of super soldiers, right? That's about national power. And so why don't we do it? And the answer is, right, people thought that was a bridge too far. So I think the question about AGI is either one of two things. There is a lot of money behind it, and the money would be, it would suffer some loss or reduced return, perhaps, if you were to like box this in a little bit. And then I think the other thing is maybe people have a technological deterministic view. It's like, hey, it's going to happen. So, might as well be me that creates it or the US that creates it. Or I'd rather have Dario create it than Sam, or Demis more than Dario, or whatever your hierarchy is, right, in this world of AI labs. So I think that's another part of it, right? Or third, they actually don't believe that it's going to have this transformative impact as it's promised it to, which is to say it's going to have a lot of impact on the labor force, perhaps, right? Automating, basic processes in the economy, but it's not going to be something, right, that is our overlord, or have an alignment issue, or, that outsources 98% of the employees. So maybe they have a view that, right, it's not quite as impactful as maybe, Yudkowsky and that group would.
Yeah. And well, I guess my hope, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is that I guess we keep up our bilateral talks and our track twos with the other great powers. China's the numero uno here. So that if we do get closer to something that feels like it's not being deployed, it's being conjured, right? At a certain point, there's a set of capabilities a thing could have where you're no longer really deploying it, right? It's not a Roomba, at that point. So I think there, if that time cometh, I think there should be ways to rip the cord and say, hey, international community, where do we want to go with this? That's kind of my hope.
No, I hope so too. And those conversations should start now, right? Where we actually are understanding like what's happening at Tsinghua, what's happening out in Hangzhou, right? Where all of their AI companies are located. Those conversations should be happening now between executives of the labs, as well as between national leaders, because you want to kind of understand what's going on. And I think one can be in a competition with China and still have those kind of conversations, right? And do avoid this notion of like, it is very destabilizing to say, we're racing to some end state where we have a locked-in permanent advantage. Because again, any nation, international relations theory, as well as world history tells us, when people are confronted with that dilemma, like, hey, my adversary is going to have an army so big, I can't defeat it in 2 years. Well, the response to that is, let's start the war today.
Yeah,
right?
Thucydides trap kind of stuff.
Exactly. So why wait 2 years when they'll defeat us for sure? And Eric Schmidt, Alexander Wong, Dan Hendricks wrote that paper where they talk about these kind of questions. Rand is doing a lot of work on that. But if we get to this level of super weapon or locked-in national advantage, right, there's going to be a response from the rest of the world against us. And so managing that is just like a very smart thing if you care about what AI can do for us beneficially.
Yeah. So, and we're going to get into that kind of what dialogues would look like. I know we talked before the mic was hot around sort of having a better understanding across the pond mutually here, and I can't wait to unpack that with you. I want to just quickly touch on sort of like best case, worst case scenarios with this present competition as it currently stands. If we start with maybe sort of like the ways this would go poorly for the future in your conception. One thing you've made clear is if we're all talking race and every policy decision is to immediately lock in an advantage in the final competition of which kingdom rules forever, that would maybe lead us to rashness and towards aggression in ways that aren't warranted, aren't best, et cetera, et cetera. This seems to be one of the worst cases that you've painted out. What else would be like ways it could go wrong? U.S. and China are where they are now with AI. U.S. maybe a little head in here, China maybe a little head over in power generation, whatever the case may be. If it moves forward, but in ways where you're like, this is getting worse, what are the ways that you're most wary of this dynamic going wrong?
I think you could imagine a couple of other failure modes. So we already talked about the arms race, the analogy to the nuclear competition with the Soviets, later the Chinese, and how that could, prompt actually kinetic activity, right? Strikes, yes. Or at minimally like some kind of cyber activity. But the other race analogy that's used, they actually framed this in the AI action plan for the Trump administration, is the space race, which the U.S. obviously won the space race. We were the first people and the only people yet to put men on the moon. But, I think what's interesting is if you look at the history of the space race, there are a lot of people who will tell you that America's mania for putting a man on the moon actually set us back by decades. Because if you remember, once the Apollo program was ended, right, we went into like a truly space winter. We took 10 more years or something to get the space shuttle out the door. The space shuttle never seemed to be all that. We've really not recovered our mojo in space until Elon came along with SpaceX. And why was that? right? Maybe we didn't think about investing in the long-term infrastructure for success in space, right? Maybe we should have been working on asteroids and looking at mining those kind of things or other actions in space other than like, hey, we have
Oh,
these lunar missions and we're going to spend 3% of GDP to get ourselves to the moon, right? And then we're just going to like drop it. So you think like, what did we get out of the space race? Well, we got a lot of national pride for sure, right? We were the first place there. An amazing human achievement. It's great that the Americans did it. We got Tang and a few cool products that trace their provenance
we got Tang.
to
We got Tang out of it. Totally worth it. 3% of GDP is nothing for Tang. But anyway, yeah,
But where are we today in space, right?
it's a good
I think
question.
it's like, and people often ask this question, like in the 60s, we put men on the moon, and today, we seem to be flagging a bit. Well, part of the explanation for that, many scholars will tell you, is like we kind of had the wrong frame for the space race, which didn't end up with us killing each other. It's just like resources were misplaced along the way for a goal that, brought us a lot of pride, but didn't bring us sustainable success in the medium. So that's a way to think about another failure mode, right? It's like, are we
Whoa.
investing too much in data centers, for example, right? Could that all collapse if new architectures that are less data hungry arrive, right? That's a failure
Yeah.
mode where, you may have seen now data center growth is like half of GDP growth. It's
Oh,
like
it's
driving
gonna it's gonna be insane. Yeah.
it's driving the whole economy today, right? It's a massive
Yes.
like stimulus. It's bigger than consumer spending in the economy. So imagine like a new architecture comes along where they can do AI, with less greedy for energy and land and chips. Or imagine a world where it doesn't require, or AI itself, right? LLMs prove to be petering out at scale, right? Ends its like incredible returns, right? That will bring down the whole economy in some ways, right? It'll be a massive collapse. So you can see like a number of failure modes besides just like the military
Oh.
output that are like, you know, we have basically gone all in as a nation on a certain architecture, a certain kind of backroom requirement, these huge data centers that are going to have to be fed probably by natural gas, maybe even coal, right? I mean, all these kinds of things, right, are huge changes that if they end up, AI isn't all that, right? It's going to be a huge hit to the environment, to the economy more broadly. So that's like another failure mode. So there's like a couple of ways to think about it outside the pure like military problems that could be existentially dangerous.
Yeah. Well, the whole moon thing is worth double clicking on. So, this is fascinating. I think the normal thinking, and I'm not a scholar enough here to have any hard opinion, but you're bringing up an idea that I'll unpack. So, I think the normal shebang is normally like, hey, we really drove towards this, and America really won, and we showed our technical prowess, and we got a guy on the moon, and built this cool NASA capability. But yeah, exactly. What did it end up being worth? I think maybe the thought back then was eventually there would be moon bases and we might have some missiles there and no one else would, and that would be it. And maybe from that frame, it was the right game in town. But, and you never know exactly what game you're going to be playing in 10 years. You never know. This seems to be sort of a quality of nature that we just sort of, can't figure those things out. But I guess what you're getting at is there might have been useful things in space regarding like satellites and some security related stuff that, maybe something with a camera landing up there just to sort of validate, okay, this is the moon, might have been neato, but like, maybe if all those resources were marshaled towards let's do something more useful. Maybe there's asteroids to mine, or maybe there's other parts of the damn economy to focus on, or whatever, that we might have come out allocating those chunks of GDP in ways that are just vastly more productive. Net for America in terms of its capabilities, quality of life. Technologies are actually useful, right? Like nobody benefits from the moon landing, at least in an overt way outside of Tang. Is this what you're saying? I want to make sure I'm grokking what you're putting on the table.
Yeah, I think that counterfactual is important to ask because I think nearly everyone agrees that the US in space in the last 50 years has not been a great success for us, right? The space shuttle was all right, but it didn't seem to nobody was enthralled by the space shuttle. And, I think a sense of hey, America lost it somewhere. I think the interesting question is maybe we lost it by focusing so much about manned missions to the moon, which, yes, brought us a lot of national pride. I don't want to underestimate that. I mean, to show American moxie and can do, right? The first example is always, hey, we put a man on the moon, but we did
Of
it
course.
60 years ago, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And so the issue is one can have a race to something, but you should ask what's this goal? And is it requiring even if you were very interested in space, right? Is this very sexy goal of putting a man on the moon actually going to take away from decade upon decade success in space exploration? That actually, I think, is an open and debated question.
Yeah.
And I think a case can be made, right, that the failures of space in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and for most of this century can be attributed to perhaps that we didn't really think it through right in the 60s.
Pretty fascinating. There's doubtless there's some scholar on this. I'm certainly not he, but that's warranted. Your data center analogy warranted. Who knows what next architecture will happen? What component of winter might emerge in some place, or what takeoff might emerge in some place where huge wild investments sort of become a fool's errand, and maybe too many chips and too many eggs in one particular basket, whatever the case may be. Before we get into policy, I'll sort of ask what you would consider to be kind of best case dynamics between the U.S. and China as these things grow. One is that you're saying is maybe we frame it more as a competition. We look rationally at where things are going. We make decisions. I presume also maybe some degree of active discourse and connected communication between leadership of the competing company or countries is happening around shared benefits and risks. But these are just things that are coming up based on what you've said earlier in our conversation. Anything else for you about what kind of going well might look like? Hey, Dan, if we chat in 2 years and these things are happening between the US and China as these technologies are getting more and more powerful, I'll kind of feel hey, things are going well. This is what I would have hoped for our international community here. Anything like that for you?
Sure. I think there should be more international cooperation on AI, which isn't to say that we have to be beholden to what other nations do, but we should be talking to them all, right? And trying to understand what they're doing, understand best practices. For nuclear powers like Russia and China, we certainly should be talking about agreements not to use AI in nuclear command and control, about how AI might be used for missile defense, which is also destabilizing, right? Or some kind of cyber weapon or electromagnetic pulse. People have talked about using AI for that, right? These kind of extraordinary military uses of AI, and having some discussions about that, and even maybe agreements about that, which I think would be in the U.S. interest as well as the globe's interest. So that's part of it. And then I think, a best case scenario for me, a realistic best case for the United States is to say, hey, we maintain a 3 to 5 year lead in our supply of the top chips. We have a 6 to 12 month lead in frontier models. And we have used this lead in AI to transform our economy to once again be an economic manufacturing powerhouse, right? So right now, a big fear, just to digress for a moment, is China might be behind us by 6 to 8 months in models. But do you have any doubt that the first people to actually develop robots are going to be in China, right? Their domination of the stack of the technology for robots is overwhelming. And so that question of we are learning to operationalize it, use AI in ways that, right, are making us a wealthier, more prosperous country. China's not going to be left in the cold. They're 6 to 12 months behind us. But they're going to catch up at some point in time. But we use this advantage we have, right, to really create kind of a national infrastructure, if you will, that can transform America's economy in a way that today, right, so many of us fear that what China's doing in manufacturing, right, just dominates us, right? Batteries to drones to AI to robotics, right? We have a whole stack that's and an ecosystem, right, that we don't have here, and that maybe we can use AI to achieve that and revitalize that aspect of American prosperity.
So is the frame here, hey, maybe we look at what China has some advantages of, we try to build some of that stuff ourselves, we get more prosperous, it's not accelerating war. They get more prosperous, it's not accelerating war, right? Their population's aging. Maybe they're treating their elderly folks even a little bit better. They're able to kind of help out on that. It seems like citizens are a little happier. Economy seems to be going well on both sides of the pond. Is that sort of we would hope for that to be sort of the state that we start cruising towards and that this stuff moves us closer to?
Yeah, that's a competition to me, right? I want the U.S. to be in the lead, but there's no winning that competition, right? AI is always changing. It's getting better on the margin. We want the U.S. to have the leading labs in this space. You're not freezing China into some permanent state of disadvantage, right? In 6 months, they're going to be where we are today. Recognize that, right? Try to mitigate some of the dangers that might arise at the national security sphere, right, by being realistic about what AI can do. And to the extent it can create super weapons or EMPs or massive cyber strikes, you probably want to talk to, yes, your adversaries to try to have some kind of negotiated deal where both sides don't engage in that kind of behavior, right? That could actually lead to the use of nuclear weapons and finally, right, destroy the entire planet. AI wouldn't have done it. AI would have just been like a unwitting accomplice in this kind of stuff. So that's a good scenario for me.
Cool. Okay. So now we'll get into sort of what maybe policymakers should be considering here. I'm going to focus on policy more than the innovators like the OpenAIs, et cetera, with you, simply because at your institute there, of course, this is sort of where you're knuckled down most of the time. There's three things we talked about pre-interview in terms of things that would be really worth poking into around policy and what you would hope for and look towards. And one of them, and it was very interesting, and I'd love for you to unpack this further, is sort of a further understanding of what's happening with China. Man, in order to have all this stuff go well, we should know where they're planning on going and what they're planning on doing and what the latest breakthroughs are there, et cetera. Maybe go into some detail about where you think the biggest gaps are in that regard and what you hope happens to close those gaps. So sort of, presumably China knows really well what we're up to, but it doesn't really feel like we do the same. What are your thoughts?
No, I think we don't really know what China does, or we don't seem to care enough what China does.
Yeah.
I mean, I am informed by this because I was once upon a time a professor of international relations, and I was always very interested in the history of the Cold War. And, the U.S. had certain views that we all now take for granted about how the Soviet Union was acting. But most of the new historians of the Cold War will tell you that the U.S. didn't really understand the Soviet motivations. We never made the effort to really get away from our own biases, our own motivated reasoning, if you will. And that the history of the Cold War is we didn't really understand what the true Soviet motivations were, which were probably ones that we could have worked with a bit better than taking the world to the edge of nuclear annihilation. So come to what we're doing with China, right? Are we really understanding what China's after? I think there is a view among a lot of people in Washington, D.C., that China, again, they're going to try to win this. They'll cut every corner. They don't even care about safety questions or modest regulation, right? They're going to just engage in, some wild project to achieve AGI. But when you talk to people who do read Mandarin and follow what's happening in Chinese politics and the Chinese military, right, they will tell you that the Chinese are quite interested in safety questions, only for their own domestic purposes, maybe not even for global reasons, right? That they're worried about what AGI could do, right, to the CCP's control of the country, these kinds of things. And so I think this idea that we're in a race that we have to kind of embrace recklessness just to make sure we're the first person across the finish line isn't the same race that the Chinese seem to be in. And my fear is we're just recreating some of the mistakes of the Cold War again, where we didn't make the effort to really understand what the Soviets were thinking. And we could have perhaps adjusted and still pursued American ambitions, but in a way that was less costly and less dangerous.
So, when I think about, okay, we need to know more of what's happening with China or what have you, I presume this, from an espionage standpoint or something like that. And certainly I'm sure there's plenty of that going back and forth. And, we've had Mike Brown on the show who's talked about sort of the technology transfer stuff with China. And there's a bunch of that. But what you're actually saying is really this competitor of ours has reasons they're doing what they're doing and things that are most important for them to get to and maybe levels of progress they're arriving at. And if we more thoroughly understand that, it's almost like an empathy point more than an espionage point of sort of, we'll kind of know, okay, as international players in this greater game that's going to sort of affect everybody, here's how we have to talk to them. Here's how we have to think about where they're headed. Here's how we have to assess what the relative risks of this or that are, that we can do that better all together if there's more actual understanding of sort of where they're headed, how they're thinking, what they're doing, rather than just assuming they're like us or assuming they have some immediate world domination and goal with every single step they take. Am I picking up what you're putting down?
Yeah, exactly. It comes back to the arms race framing, right? If you're in an arms race, the person you're racing against is an enemy, right? We don't have an arms race with France or the UK or Germany, right? So it kind of presupposes that China is an enemy of the United States. And the first thing you do, history tells you, when you have an enemy, is you kind of treat them as like almost non-human. They're an other, right? They're not rational actors. They're uniquely barbaric, right? There are people who you can't talk to them or even fathom what would motivate them. And that's a very dangerous place for our statesmen to be, right? Because whatever one can think about the Tsinghua graduate engineers, right, who are running China these days, is they're super smart people, right? They're rational actors. And, they have a plan. And that plan might be inimical to American interests, but we should actually understand what the rules that they're operating under, right? What the bureaucratic situation is, what they can do and not to do in China, the actual control they might have over the country, the military-civil relations, right, which are quite complicated to China. And so I think instead of doing this really hard, almost anthropological work, it's easy to say, oh my God, right, these people are intent on world domination.
Well, you can't trust them. You can't trust them farther than you can throw them, so you better yada, 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 right?
And you have to assume the worst. I mean, it's one thing to have the worst as part of your planning assumptions, right? You can deal with that. But once you also understand, right, the real limitations on what their power is and what limitations might exist on their ambitions and actually what their ambitions might be at the grandiose level, right? But I don't think we really are reading enough Mandarin publications. We're not translating enough. We're not talking to the people enough to where we really understand, here's what China's trying. Here's how they think about it, not as a technical matter, but as a social matter.
Yeah. Okay. So this is great. This has never been brought up in past episodes. So I like that point. I think it's warranted. I think there should be Twitter accounts and blogs that talk about what are the Chinese leaders thinking? What are the latest academic breakthroughs in China? What's the directions they seem to be headed in? What do the leaders there actually seem to care about when we look at their actions over time? Again, they are people. It's not the great gray enemy whose minds are imperceptible and they act in a totally different way than us. Certainly there's some serious differences. And as you and I well know, they're a lot more fettered in what they can talk about and how than you and I in all contexts, no matter whose soil they're standing on. It's a very spooky situation, but they're still humans. And I think you're pointing out of that error of the Cold War seems really, really apt for the time we're in now. This takes us into our second point around kind of direct communication with China. I brought up off microphone kind of track two dialogues and sort of potentially the importance of doing that. And you talked about direct bilateral talks with actual government leadership in addition to track two. There's a whole, of course, I guess we could think of it as a tapestry of connection that keeps the U.S. and France in touch and keeps the U.S. and Brazil in touch and keeps the U.S. even in Russia in touch. Even countries that are sort of adversarial in some way, shape, or form. There's still tapestries of connection that, if things go well, at least keep us civil and at least try to work towards a net good. What is that tapestry of connection between bilateral talks, track two, and more that you hope to see flourish between the U.S. and China around AI specifically?
I hope AI gets maybe more salient. I mean, when Marco Rubio meets with his counterpart in Beijing, they have a lot to chat about, right? From the South China Sea to Taiwan to the Belt and Road Initiative to, a billion other things. My fear is that AI probably just hasn't reached the relevance, right, to make it to the top of their agenda. But it has to going forward, right? This technology is going to be so powerful. It's driving a lot of the animus toward China in this country today, right? This idea of racing and how important AI is to our own economy and to theirs. So I think, yes, it has to become more salient, right? Where policymakers talk about it at the highest levels, from the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, the President himself, as well as at the Track 2 level. To the extent we do military to military relations, which have become frayed over the years, right? The generals need to be talking about these kind of questions among themselves, like how they think about it for military uses. One of the interesting things, coming back to your Cold War analogy, is, the U.S. has certain views of how the Navy worked, how aircraft carriers work. Well, I'll tell you, interesting, when I was very young, I was into this question. The U.S. was obsessed and remains kind of obsessed with the aircraft carrier. The Soviets didn't do that. They had aircraft carriers, but not as many or as advanced as we were. So I used to ask, they had the Nobel Prize winning physicists. They had some of the most brilliant engineers, mathematicians in the Soviet Union at the time. Why didn't they think like we did about this question? How do they view the world differently? And that question is a really interesting one, right? Which catches a lot of we live in these certain environment, right, where we take certain things for granted, but people in different environments approach these problems very differently and offer different solutions. So what you want to do is talk to the Chinese and say, how are you really thinking about this? Why are you approaching it this way, not that way? Why do you think AGI might mean a super weapon when this guy doesn't, right? Maybe you have a powerful case that I'm not tracking, right? That it's the nuclear, maybe we should have had as many carriers, right? If we'd been understanding better, what the best Soviet defense intellectuals were thinking. That's, I think, really helpful because they're bringing a different frame that challenges a lot of the assumptions that we just carry as the furniture of our mind.
Yeah. Of course, in those dialogues, what they say about what is AGI or what isn't will have to be whatever the party line is. And on some level, Americans have to do that as well. But I think it's a little bit more stringent with China. But still, truth will squeak through about ultimately how are we thinking about this, and ultimately where do we think this is going, and ultimately what do you think is going to be an issue there between us or between you and your own citizens or whatever the case may be. And as you mentioned, there's kind of a military knitting of conversation. There's sort of, the Rubio level, sort of president level knitting of this conversation as the stuff becomes more salient. And I suspect it will. It seems to me like AI is only going to become more prominent. And then the Track 2 side of it as well. So the last point I want to bring up is sort of the export control side of the coin here. Because, as you've brought up, and I think many pretty level-headed folks who've been in leadership positions in the United States, many of those who I've spoken to have been former DOD people, not war hawks at all, but also, like to make sure we're ahead a bit. Let's make sure, we invent something, we can sort of run with that for a little while. Maybe if it's not an eternal advantage, at least a bit here, keep ourselves strong. The sort of export control thing seems to be part of that mix. Hardware is a big part of how AGI will come about. Power generation is a big part of how AGI comes about. You've thought a little bit about kind of chips, chip verification, etc. What do you think leaders need to be discussing more and strategizing about more on that chip side of the coin?
So I think they need to recognize, and I think most do, Democrats, Republicans alike, that we have only an advantage in a third of the AI stack, if you will: compute, data, and hardware, and energy, right? If you think of those like the three ingredients of AI, the Chinese will best us on the energy front. They have access to a lot of data and probably fewer qualms about privacy and some of the reasons we might limit people's access to data. So they will defeat us on those two metrics. The one metric where the U.S. and the West clearly has an advantage is in compute, meaning the hardware, right, the chips. And for us to give that away to people who we think of as an adversary or a competitor, right, when there's so much optionality still around AI, what it's going to actually be, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so, yes, I've been a big advocate, ARI has been a big advocate for saying the U.S., to me, if I were the president, I would have an open policy saying it is the goal of the United States to maintain a 5-year lead over the rest of the world in advanced chips and work to achieve that. Now, that's not easy to do, right? We have to indigenize a lot of production. I'm hoping actually myself that, what Trump is talking about doing with Intel, taking a stake in it, you could make Intel the domestic foundry for chips, kind of things like that. All are actually quite important. But it comes back to this idea that chips are the one thing that are gives the U.S. its advantage. And we should be very wary about just promiscuously letting NVIDIA sell those to other people.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like, I'm essentially certain that, if China was making those chips, they wouldn't just be schlepping them over the pond, just in unbridled, capitalism for the individual companies, right? I mean, I think there's all sorts of understandings here of quote unquote private corporations in China on some level sort of being a wing of sort of the government efforts, greater and lesser extents. So I think it's a little bit of a tough reality. It's sort of like, okay, well, we don't see these as inhuman, horrible, barbaric enemies, but we understand that there are some serious differences in our styles of governance and sort of objectives in different geopolitical domains. And while we're not putting them down in some regard, we're going to ensure that some of the few advantages that we've got, we can continue to steward forward. Just as China is probably, if they could pipe power just for free to Wisconsin for free, or even for money, if they could pipe power to our data centers or whatever, they might not, just if that's one of their advantages, and somewhat understandably so. I think it feels like there's this. We can be civil. We can know there's differences. We can try to keep our advantages, and we can still try to not be enemies while we're doing it. It feels like this is kind of the tightrope we are walking here. Do you think about it differently?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I feel like what I hear from NVIDIA would have been like in 1978, having, the head of Boeing or Lockheed Martin come and say, hey, we're going to sell stealth technology to the Soviets, right? It's a great market, right? They have advanced fighter jets. One of the few places in the world that has advanced fighter jets. This stealth is like revelatory. And hey, we need the market share. He wouldn't have done it, right? That was like our great advantage. And I think what's important for people to recognize is, like, take the H20 chip, which is what they've now in the last couple of weeks permitted. Where's that going to be used? The military will use it because inference for intelligence purposes, right? Inference compute is can help improve, the H20 can help improve like intelligence assimilation, right, from different sources. It's also, what do we most dislike about some of the things that China is doing domestically? Take out in Xinjiang, right, the surveillance state in Xinjiang, right? Inference chips will help drive the AI being used to prop up that surveillance state. The H20 we're selling them is going to be used in exactly that spot. So, right, we're giving, even if it didn't have military applications or you're worried about AGI, why would you give people tools that allow them to do some of the things that we in the US are most offended by in Chinese politics?
Yeah. It's clear there's reasons there. And you talked a little bit about kind of chip verification, geolocation sorts of things. What do you see as, maybe there's hardly anybody, there's maybe 6 or 7 people with really coherent visions of what that could look like in 5 years, like all the way down to writing the damn code. But just at a conceptual level, what do you sort of hope to see discussed and taken seriously as ways of handling that?
I think it starts with the recognition that export controls are quite leaky right now, right? There's a massive smuggling operation around the globe to get the best chips into China, and some of the other nations as well. Russia as well has been on the lookout, right, for some of these kind of black market H100s and the other top chips. So it starts from that recognition. So the idea is like we should do something better, right? Because in many ways, we would love to see chips proliferate around the globe. It helps the American tech industry, right? It gets people addicted to the American tech stack. They all learn CUDA and they can't flip to
exactly.
Huawei's.
Huge lock-in, yeah.
And so the idea, we would like to lock people in. So how do you ensure they're not being diverted to nations that you don't like or used for purposes you don't like? And some kind of geolocation tracking, on-chip, off-chip verification, confidential computing. There's a lot of ideas out there. I think the danger I see in it is we're big supporters of ARI, and we want to see this happen. I don't want us to invest in technologies that are easily beaten by nation state actors with incredible motivation and think we have, hey, we're actually restricting chips, when in fact, right, we're putting a lot of false hope in things that are beatable, right, by motivated adversaries. And I think right now, one of the great challenges for us is when you talk to people who are experts in the electronics of these chips, right? A foolproof method of on-chip or even off-chip verification is not easy to do. And if it's not easy to do and it can be beaten, then you do worry, or I worry about misplaced reliance upon a technology that's actually not that reliable to begin with. But that being said, this must be a massive effort from us to research this question, right? To find better ways to do it, and then to ensure that the companies, we compel them to use this technology once it's reliable.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point too about not even knowing what the next paradigms are. Who knows if, something in addition to chip verification will be important in 3 years when some other paradigm sort of hits us that's more software than hardware driven, whatever the case may be. But clearly with hardware being as crucial as it is and seemingly as crucial into the future as it's going to be, those conversations sort of have to be happening on some level. I really appreciate, Brad, the very level-headed, measured takes you've had here. I think a lot of the new ideas and Cold War analogies have also been pretty illuminating. I'm certain that they are for the audience as well. I'm aware that that's all we had for time, but it's been a real blast, and I appreciate you being able to join us today.
Dan, my honor to be on the show.
So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. A big thank you to Brad for being able to be with us, and thank you to you for listening all the way through to the end of this episode. This has again been our 5th episode in U.S.-China AGI Relations. Without a doubt, we'll have other episodes in this series in the future. Worthy successor is always our main meat and potatoes here, but I like having these other series to garner perspectives on important topics that relate to the trajectory of intelligence. A few things that stuck out to me with regards to Brad's episode that I'd like to touch on. I really felt as though he had a strong point to be made around really understanding China and how if we normalize sort of a better general understanding of China, this would be a good thing. He talked about how in the Cold War, more recent scholars of the Cold War have sort of criticized the U.S. for maybe not understanding Russia's motivations or maybe assuming Russia's motivations. I think we do a good deal of that with China as well. Certainly, there are limitations to what we can expect in terms of honesty from adversaries. Some people would say with China, that's a particular issue. We've had some past guests that have mentioned such things on the show. But I think seeing them as people is big. And Brad brings up 2 points I thought were really salient. One of them is direct governmental dialogue and track 2 conversations being kind of a very rich ecosystem. We've talked about that before. The second is translating, understanding, and talking more about Chinese perspectives on AI policy, AI safety, artificial general intelligence. It seems rather likely to me that of the few people that, and maybe it's more than I think, but the impression I got coming back from Shanghai talking to people in the ecosystem is there's not as much AGI risk talk in China as in the States. But of the people who care about it, presumably Bostrom, Yudkowsky, they're at least tertiarily familiar with, and I'm sure they have their own thinkers as well. We certainly don't know anything about their thinkers. Yoshua Bengio has some perspectives I'm sure people would be aware of in China if they care about such things. But the Bengio equivalents in China, in the English-speaking world, we're just sort of wholly unaware of. I think there's a real point in Brad's discussion here that if we were translating from Mandarin, which is remarkably easy now, sort of how they're thinking about AGI and how they're thinking about risk and how they're thinking about safety. Surely in China, they can make sure the only things that come through and are even translatable are things that are sort of congenial with the CCP's power structure. I'm frustrated by that. I consider it to be quite likely. But nonetheless, there are some thinkers that have ideas that are not just CCP slop around how AGI safety could come about, around the limitations of AI development in general, the demands for power, for hardware, etc. And I think if we sort of knew some of their main thinkers, where they're thinking, where they're headed, what their governments are thinking, this would also sort of humanize the discourse. It would maybe allow us to come to the table with a little bit more mutual shared understanding. And I thought that was really, really salient. I hope we do that. I told Brad, I hope there's Twitter handles that just translate the coolest stuff happening in AGI and AI in China from the government and from the universities and from the big labs and sort of summarize them for the US market. How is there not at least one Twitter handle that's built 100,000 subscribers, followers just for that? And why isn't there, YouTube channel for that? It really feels like that's actually a way to tighten up the gap. And again, not just have more productive conversations with China, but also sort of humanize China. It's not just this firewall and then they're not even people back there. It's very different than that. They are people for some of us who've been to China, as it turns out. In addition, we brought up sort of the tension at the end here of, and we can keep that humanizing stuff going on. Also understand there is a bit of an adversarial tension and we want to make sure we stay ahead and stay strong. And that's a balanced factor with being open and having the conversation. Again, Brad brought up the analogy of sort of, selling stealth technology to the Russians. There's probably something like that with China as well, where it makes sense that they're going to keep some of their advantages. We'll keep some of ours. I think we can both do that and see each other as humans and be familiar with each other's thinking and be familiar with each other's at least high level predictions, understanding priorities, etc. And hopefully have net better outcomes and avoid, kinetic war and the really bad hoopla that could obviously happen in this AGI competition. Brad obviously doesn't like the word race, so word competition. Those are my quick reflections on this episode. I really liked the translation idea. I hope to see it. If you know of anybody already doing it, hit me on Twitter, reply in a YouTube comment, whatever. I'd be very, very interested to see where that goes. But anyway, with that said, that's it for this episode. I'll catch you next week here on The Trajectory.